Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the worst forecast created by professionals in the 2022 midterm elections. Now, a few things before I get into this and analyze this forecast. The first thing I want to say is that there are worse forecasts you can find on Twitter, YouTube, maybe Reddit, although I'm not a Reddit user, so I don't know. But I'm sure you can find a map or a Senate/governor map that is worse than the one that I'm about to show you. That being said, the criteria here is professional. I know there were a lot of amateur people on YouTube who, predicted maps that were more off than this, and I'm sure you can find, I can think of some in my head of people on Twitter that just posted maps. But again, those people aren't, being paid to do this for a living. Those people are just kind of random people posting their opinions on Twitter, right? And so the criteria here is to look at professional, like verified actual websites or models and which one was most wrong. And so the answer to that is Real Clear Politics. And again, this isn't, a hit video on RCP. I'm not the biggest fan of theirs, and I'll be first to admit that. But I also don't really want to get to the point where I'm just slandering them for fun. Because again, I think a lot of people did that with 530 after 2020, and I wasn't a big fan of it. And, I'm not going to be the guy who jumps on RCP every second, even though I do think their forecast was bad, and I called it out on November 7th, and I'm going to continue to do that today. So let's start by looking at the governor's map. And the first thing you're going to notice here is that they had a pretty Republican-leaning map overall. They had Republicans at 30 governor's mansions, Democrats 20. So they had them, flipping Michigan, beating Whitmer, beating Evers in Wisconsin, beating Kelly in Nevada, beating Kelly in Kansas, beating Sisolak in Nevada. They also had Carrie Lake holding on to the governorship in Arizona over Katie Hobbs. The only competitive seats that they gave to the Democrats, and competitive is a stretch for some of these, were Oregon, where they gave Tina Kotek the edge over Christine Drazan, Pennsylvania, where they gave Josh Shapiro the edge over Doug Mastriano, and then Maine, where they had Janet Mills holding on against Paul LePage. And so let's just take a look at these states, and we're going to look at the ones they got wrong. So to their credit, the one, competitive race that they actually got right, or actually two rather, were Oregon and Nevada. And Oregon, obviously, they got that right because they had Tina Kotek winning, and she's going to, I think she won by 3.5. Then in Nevada, Joe Lombardo ousted incumbent Democrat Steve Sisolak by about 1.4%. So they got those two races right, although, again, their projection wasn't great. They had, it was all right. They had them up by 3, so, not terrible necessarily per se. But anyways, let's take a look at this map. So the first race they got wrong was Arizona. And if you take a look, whoa, can I not open a new tab? Really? Okay, that's not fun. So the first race you'll notice here that they missed was Arizona. And they had Carrie Lake winning by 3.5. So it was a fairly substantial margin. This was no, squeaker that they got wrong. They had Lake up by 3.5. And again, they ended up underestimating Hobbs by about 4%. Now, in fairness, this is not, their worst take. Again, a lot of people prior to the election had Katie Hobbs losing. But they had Hobbs down by a pretty substantial amount for any election in Arizona. And if you take a look at their polls, they thought she was surging right around the time of the election. We ended up learning that was not the case. So that was their first miss. And again, it was pretty big, a 4-point miss in any state as well outside the margin of error for any respectable poll. And I think that's pretty bad. Now, if you take a look at their next governor miss, which is Kansas, it, wasn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. I think there were a lot of reasons to think Kansas was going to go to the GOP. And again, they actually didn't have an average. They just picked Kelly to lose for whatever reason. But the thing I don't get is, again, the only two polls going into their average were a D+3 poll and a D+2 poll. So again, this is a polling website that's supposed to be making their predictions off of their own aggregate, which again has its own set of problems entirely. But if this is a polling website that's supposed to be making their predictions off of their own, calculations based on these polls, I do not know how they could get Laura Kelly to win. And that's the part I have a problem with. Again, this site is run by Republicans. We know this, and I think it's perfectly fine. I think it's good for both Republicans and Democrats and independents to to have their opinions and to talk about elections, right? The issue here is that, again, they pulled this out of nowhere. They had no methodology. They had no, reasoning, right? And I know that a bit of this is unfair because, again, I got this race wrong too. I thought Laura Kelly was going to lose as well, but I actually had a reasoning, and I showed my margins, and I showed the full process. What they did here is they went against their entire website's values and just picked Eric Schmidt for, reasons. And that's the part I don't like with this race. And then, it doesn't get much better. In Wisconsin, they had Tim Michaels up by about half a point over Tony Evers, the incumbent Democrat. Again, totally reasonable race to get wrong. I get it. There were a lot of reasons to think Tony Evers was on his way out. However, if you take a look at their polls, they missed this race by, just like Arizona, about 4 points. And they thought, they had Evers leading pretty consistently throughout the cycle. You actually led as recent to the election as Halloween. And they, gave Michaels the lead at the end of the election. I get, there was some new polls. But again, they throw out a lot of polls that were good for Evers. And this is a problem I had with RCP throughout the entire election cycle. They would, polls that were good for Republicans would go straight into the aggregate, whereas the polls that were bad for Republicans, they just toss half of them out. And that's why they got skewed results like this. So again, there were polls that showed Tony Evers ahead. There were, almost, I think 60% of them did or something like that. But what they did was they skewed their average intentionally to get a more Republican-leaning result. They got that result. They predicted it, and they ended up with egg on their face about it. Even though, again, this was a toss-up race, clearly. And again, I know a lot of people didn't get this race right. Now, this is the miss that I think is just brutal. Completely brutal. Because it's so bad on so many levels. So first of all, Whitmer won by 10.5. So it was not even close, right? She won 54.4 to 43.9. So it was not a particularly close election. And I had Whitmer winning. I think, a lot of people had Whitmer winning. It was pretty consensus that she was going to win, although I'm not sure that everyone predicted that, margin of victory. But what I will say is that I don't get where RCP got their prediction from. Because again, on the original map, they had Tudor Dixon winning, right? They expected Tudor Dixon to win this race, okay? And if you look at, and it says it here actually, RCP protection, GOP pickup, okay? And even their own average, which again was very skewed towards Republicans, they tossed out a lot of good polls for Democrats, kept in the good polls for Republicans, and weighted everything to skew it towards Tudor Dixon. Even that average had Whitmer up by a point. And then they still went out of their way to predict a Tudor Dixon victory. Why? We'll never know. They never told us. But that's the problem I have with this forecast. If they are trying to be a reputable polling website, making predictions off of, their own aggregate, their own calculations with the polls they're given, they should be sticking to those convictions, right? Kansas should have had Laura Kelly winning, and they would have been right, by the way. They would have been right. Michigan, even with this average, it would have been better than having, that terrible 1-point victory projection for Tudor, for Gretchen Whitmer, which, again, still very bad. But then, to just go on top of that to project Tudor Dixon to win when your own average, which, again, very skewed to begin with, shows something else, to me makes literally no sense at all. I just, I do not understand how they got that number, and it just baffles me because, again, it was pretty clear, even at the time that Whitmer was going to win. The margin, not necessarily, but I was pretty convinced Whitmer was going to win. I think even a lot of Republicans were convinced Whitmer was going to win. Their own average thought she was going to win, and they went out of their way to just predict her to lose. So that, to me, does not make any sense whatsoever. So let's now look at their Senate map. And their Senate map is a little better, but again, that's because there wasn't as big of a battleground. We'll start in Nevada. All right, this was just an egregious miss on their part. They had Laxalt up by 3.5. He lost by almost a point. That's a 4.5% miss on their part. And so, again, how that happened, I don't know. I don't know how they got Laxalt up by 3.5. To me, it was pretty clear that even if Laxalt won, which, by the way, was possible, I didn't predict it, but I thought, he had maybe a 40% chance of winning. I did not expect to be, more than a point and a half. And they came out here, said Laxalt's up by 3.4%. They had him surging by election day. Again, they would have been right if they, closer to right if they predicted this, 2 weeks prior, right? Because they had it within a point either way. They then showed, just a surge towards Laxalt at the end, which, again, completely ridiculous based on their own set of polls. There, we got good polls from, Nevada Independent that showed Cortez Masto doing well. RCP average was like, well, we're not going to weight this. We don't really care. We're not going to talk about it, right? They literally did not put it in their own average. And that's what skewed the result so much. That's why Laxalt was ahead by 3.5 points, despite the fact that A, he was never going to win by that much, even if he did win, and B, he still lost. He still lost despite all the polls that were in this average. So that's I think the first race they were pretty bad on. But another race they were even worse on was Arizona, where Mark Kelly won by 5 points. They had him losing by about 0.3%. And again, they had they would have been right if they stopped doing this in, first week of October, because he was up by 4.5. They would have been pretty close. Okay. They had Kelly up the entire cycle. Then what happens, literally the day before he's up by 0.3. On election day, Blake Masters takes the lead, right? No, real reason why, again, they put in Trafalgar, which we now know to be completely ridiculous. DFP obviously was skewing their own numbers, right? But the polls that they put in, they skewed heavily towards Republicans. It's the same thing. I keep saying it, and I'll stop saying it after this. But again, the polls they put in, they skewed heavily towards Republicans. They didn't even put in half the good polls for Democrats. That's why they were so bad. That's why they got these numbers that were never accurate. To me, it was pretty clear Blake Masters was going to lose. I didn't expect him to lose by 5. I thought he'd lose by 2 or 3. But he was never really in a position to win unless you were living in red eagle politics, his brain, which I guess RCP was. But again, that's not how this is working. That is not, an accurate way to predict an election. And again, that's why I think they were so off in Arizona, because again, they would have been right had they stuck to, what the actual numbers were saying instead of just giving Masters that last second boost literally at the 11th hour. They also missed big in Pennsylvania. They had Dr. Oz up by about half a point here. And again, same story. Fetterman was up pretty consistently. And again, they would have been right had they stopped. Let's see here. Had they stopped in, where's this 5-point lead? Let's find a 5-point lead for Fetterman. There's never one. But, they would have been decently correct if they stopped in the beginning of September, which, again, was a while ago, in fairness to them. But again, Fetterman led every day until the week before the election, right? Like November 3rd, which was, I think November 3rd was a Thursday or something, maybe a Wednesday. Fetterman was ahead until those days. And so I think, when you look at those numbers, it's pretty easy to see why they got the race wrong. They, again, were biased towards Oz. They didn't think Fetterman could win. And intentionally, the numbers that they put in were very favorable to him for really not any good reason. Again, they could have put in, a better set of polls that would have been more reflective of the electorate at the time. They probably would have gotten maybe a 1 or 2 point Fetterman lead. Instead, they chose to ostracize good polls for Fetterman, skew the polls that were in there towards Dr. Oz, and that's why they got Oz leading, despite the fact that it ended up not even being close. By the way, the current results say Fetterman plus 4.5. He actually won by 4.8, which is interesting, but very minor complaint there. So that's why they were wrong, right? Like, they put in very bad polls for the ones they actually did put in. They took out a lot of the good polls for Democrats, and then the ones they did put in, they just applied a bunch of numbers or a bunch of swings towards Republicans. So again, if you look at this map, I created it really quickly. I might have missed a state or two, but I think this is the complete map for their misses. They missed Cortez Masto in Nevada, Kelly in Kansas, Evers in Wisconsin, Whitmer in Michigan, Fetterman in Pennsylvania, and then Arizona. They had a double whammy, I guess you could say. They missed both Katie Hobbs and Mark Kelly in the state. And again, it was just because they had a terrible average in most of these states. Arizona, had a really bad average. Nevada, they had a really bad average. Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, really bad averages. In Kansas, I don't know how they got that Kelly loss, because again, in the 2 polls we had, she was up, right? So I don't know how they got that to begin with. And Michigan is just the worst, because again, Whitmer won by over 10 points. It was never really close to begin with. Even their own average, which again, very skewed towards Republicans, showed Tudor Dixon losing, and they just were like, well, we think she's going to win because, reasons, right? And that's why I, took the time to make this video, because I think a lot of people were wrong in 2020. A lot of people were wrong in 2018 and 2016, right? But at least you could see the argument for it, right? Like, the worst, I think the worst prediction you could find in 2020 was like the 413 prediction that had Biden winning like Texas, Ohio, Iowa, had Democrats winning like the South Carolina, Kansas, Montana, Iowa Senate races, right? Like, that was the worst prediction you could find. But at least you could like see like, oh, this is why I think this is why I think that, right? RCP, their method was never consistent, and in some cases it was just wildly inaccurate, like in Michigan and Kansas. And that's why I wanted to make this video. So again, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you did. Please, I hope you found it interesting. Again, leave a comment. What do you think? First of all, how off was your prediction? Because I know some of us had good predictions, some of us had bad predictions. But secondly, most importantly, how do you think RCP could, avoid this mistake in the future? Because I'm interested, because I want to see if they learn. I want to see if they actually want to make their site better and, have more reliable predictions in the future. So again, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next, which should be on Wednesday. Have a great rest of your day, guys.